So in this series of videos, we're going to explore some of the more mechanical aspects of breathing by looking at the anatomy of the chest. So this little mini-series probably should be watched alongside the handful of Khan Academy videos on the lungs, and in particular the videos on inhaling and exhaling and changing lung volume. But what I hope to do in these videos is to fill in some gaps in your understanding of breathing, and maybe even pique your interest in this topic, because I think that respiration is a really interesting topic because it's a good example of the machine that is the human body. It's a really mechanical process, and it's the mechanics of this process that we're going to focus on. So in this first video, we're going to discuss the anatomy of the rib cage. So here's my attempt to draw the rib cage. So here's the rib cage from the front, and this is the cage from the side. And the first bony element to make note of course, are the ribs. So here are the ribs. These are the ribs from the side, and these are the ribs from the front. Now you have 12 ribs, and unlike what the Bible may suggest, both men and women have an equal number of ribs. So up here you have ribs 1, 2, 3, and down here you have 11 and 12. Now connected to the ribs in the front is a bone called the sternum, or the breastbone. And this is an interesting bone. It's actually a fused bone. It's 3 bones fused into one. But for the sake of this video, all you need to know is that this is the sternum. That's the sternum from the front, and this is the sternum from the side. Now your ribs connect to the sternum, but it's actually just the first 10 ribs that have a connection to the sternum. Ribs 11 and 12 do not connect to the sternum and are said to be floating ribs. Now the final bony element to make note of is in the back of the cage. So your spinal column makes up the back of this rib cage, and the connection between the vertebra and the ribs makes up the back of the cage. So here are your vertebrae. Now all of these components together are called the thoracic cage. Sounds very dramatic. But you can see it looks like a cage. Each of these ribs looks like the bars of a cage, but it's not a cage in that it's preventing things from inside this thoracic cavity from escaping. It's not preventing your lungs from running away. It's a protective cage. It's preventing things from outside from getting in and damaging all of these fragile organs. So if we're going to discuss function, its first function is going to be protection. But it's actually a pretty strange cage in that there's a lot of movement that goes on within this cage. This cage is capable of expanding and contracting, and it has flexible elements. And if you were to design this cage, you certainly wouldn't design a protective cage with all of these flexible components. So that brings me to its other function. So first, what I've done is I had a friend of mine who does 3D graphics for computer gaming companies to throw together a little animation of this thoracic cage during the actual process of breathing. So now here we're looking at the front of this cage during respiration, and you can see there's a lot of movement that's going on. It's constantly expanding and contracting. So as you breathe in, the volume of this cage is increasing and it's expanding, and as you breathe out, it's contracting. So this is where I suggest after this video you go and watch some of the Khan Academy videos on inhaling and exhaling, because it's going to go into a bit more detail into how this helps in the process of breathing, but this is really important in breathing. So we'll come back to this animation at the end, but its other main function, the other main function of this cage is in breathing. This cage plays an active role in breathing. Your body exploits all of these movements to use this cage as a pump to draw air into and expel air from the lungs. This is really important. So how does this cage move? Well, incorporated into this cage are some movable elements, right? Bones themselves can't flex. But in this cage are components that can allow some movement. Now the first component that allows movement occurs at the connection between the vertebra and the ribs. So there's a joint connecting the vertebra to the ribs, and this allows some specific movements. It doesn't allow a large amount of movement, but if you add up these 12 little joints, it can create a lot of movement of the entire rib cage. Now the other movable component, it's more of a passive movable component, is at the front of this cage, and that's in blue here. So at the front of the cage isn't bone, it's cartilage. So I didn't tell you the whole story when I said that the ribs connect to the sternum. They don't directly connect to the sternum. I lied. They use this little cartilaginous linker to connect to the sternum. And this provides some additional flexibility to the cage during breathing. Okay, so this cage is capable of moving, but how does it move exactly? How does it move precisely? Well, there's thought to be two main movements of this cage to allow for expansion of the thoracic cavity. So the first movement of the cage we're going to talk about is this bucket handle movement. It's thought to be similar to the movement of a bucket handle. So here I've drawn a bucket. So here's our bucket. And take particular note of this handle. And imagine picking up this bucket. What's going to happen to the handle? Well, the handle's going to be raised out to the side as you pick it up. Right? It's going to be raised out laterally. And if you note that each of these ribs is angled down slightly, like that bucket handle before you've picked it up, and if you imagine picking up these ribs like you would a bucket handle, you're going to raise them up ever so slightly, and the end result is going to be that this cage expands out to the side. Right, so that's the first movement, this bucket handle movement, which expands the cage sideways. Now the other movement that this cage makes is thought to be similar to the movement of a pump handle. So here I've drawn a pump. So this is a water pump. You can see water coming out of this pump. And imagine raising this pump handle to expel water from the pump. Your cage can undergo a similar kind of movement. So imagine this sternum is like your pump handle. Imagine picking up this sternum and pulling it forwards like that. Of course, it's going to hurt. But what's going to happen is that you're going to increase the volume of this cage to the front. Okay, so that's our other kind of movement, this pump handle movement, which expands the cage frontwards. Now let's go back to our little animation to have a closer look at these movements. So here we're going to have a look at this cage from the side. You can see that all of these ribs are being raised ever so slightly. And this is that bucket handle movement that we were talking about, which expands the cage, expands the volume of the cage sideways. Also, make note of this sternum. The sternum is constantly being raised to expand this cage frontwards. Okay, so you're expanding the volume of the cage frontwards during this pump handle movement. So combined, these two kinds of movements expands the volume of the cage, which allows the cage to draw air into the lungs in this pump-like fashion. And the harder you breathe, the greater these movements are going to be during respiration. However, these bony components can't move themselves. They need muscles for movement, and it's these muscles that we're going to talk about in the next video.